Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome, distinguished guests, attendees, to the second forum on strategic raw materials organized by the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR. My name is Maddalena Procopio. I'm a senior policy fellow in the Africa program. Just for information before we start, this is a public panel and it's on the record. I will provide some brief opening remarks and then hand over for the presentation of the speakers and the moderation to my colleague Ludivine Wouters, a visiting fellow at the ECFR. Today's event on critical raw materials is the second in a series of ECFR events on the subject. The first was held last December and acknowledged the need for Europe to work more cohesively as Team Europe around the development of a strategy on CRMs to come up with an offer that is competitive vis-à-vis players such as China, the US and others. Between December and today, the Commission released its Critical Raw Materials Act, a regulation that lays out Europe's needs, capacity, ambitions to source, process, refine and recycle CRMs. CRMs, as we all know, are crucial not only in the green tech space to produce green technology that is central to our energy security as we strive to transit from fossil fuel to renewables, but also in the longer term to the digitization and defense agendas. This makes them central to today's geopolitical and geo-economic dynamics. Today, we focus on the external dimension of the CRM Act. In fact, a good part of the Act will be implemented beyond Europe's borders, making partnerships with third countries extremely important. This is even more so at a time of unceasing geopolitical tensions that have affected trade routes, supplies, international relations, and eventually people's livelihoods, and that require government and the industry to focus on diversification of partners and supply. It is not easy to ask for Europe to enter this space. We know that. China has a dominant presence in extraction, processing, refining, manufacturing. It adopts a project-specific approach to investment in the CRMs. The US is stepping up competition, prioritizing strategic partners and projects that can tap into its drive to step up US-made products. Others like Australia, Canada, India, Saudi Arabia are striving to expand their share in the field. In this context, there is an opportunity for Europe to redesign its relationship with Africa. Both continents can leverage reciprocal strengths to achieve industrialization and decarbonisation objectives while possibly integrating their value chain. This is the talk, but in reality, how feasible is it? What assets does Europe have to implement CRM-related partnerships? Where does finance can come from? Eventually, what are these partnerships to date about? These are some of the questions that we want to address today with you all. The aim is that of reducing the disconnect between policy and investment realities. Partnerships need not only to be intended in bilateral terms between the EU and third countries, but also and importantly between the EU and the industry, private capital investors, European actors in the broader energy space, in Africa and beyond. We need to connect these dots to make sure that new energy deals are concrete, viable, and effective to fulfill Europe's objectives. And we're here to do that. I hand over now to my colleague Ludivine to introduce our distinguished guests and moderate the panel. Ludivine has a very strong expertise in minerals policy, strategy, governance, with a focus on Africa and emerging powers. Ludivine, to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today, particularly those who traveled. It's really good to see you. And thank you to our amazing panel. Before I introduce them and we dive into the topic, I thought it was useful to perhaps just follow on from what Maddalena was saying and just wonder, okay, why exactly are these conversations important today? So the CRM Act was announced on the 16th of March. It includes a rising call to action from the private sector. From the Commission to the private sector, really requesting that there be a mobilization towards European objectives of diversifying and securing, supply of critical raw materials. By its own admission, Europe will continue to source up to 90% of its critical raw materials outside of its borders. So as Madalena was pointing out, this poses the question of where these minerals will be found, how they can be brought into production, and whether the EU can, and how the EU can, enable, if not drive these efforts, whilst ensuring that they result in a diverse, secure, and sustainable supply of CRMs for Europe. So right off the bat, this means that we have a multi-level, multi-stakeholder conversation to manage. And one of the questions that keeps coming up and that we need to address is the agency of many of the parties that are involved in this conversation. So the very notion of strategic partnerships, which we're here to discuss, is the EU agreeing on a framework with different African states. But then that immediately raises the question, okay, so these resource-rich countries, they do hold immense power over their resources. They can support or they can hinder their production. But they are also competing for investment. So who drives that investment decision? Yes, there are many management teams and exploration and mining companies who today make these decisions. But in reality, they are themselves beholden to the risk appetite and interest of their investors. And then we continue to think, okay, so what are investors looking at today? And the reality is investors are also looking to industrial policy and to the criticality agenda for clarification of where priorities will lie and what will actually be the business case for many of these companies. In a way, we've gone full circle. So at each of these steps, each of these levels, we can have sound communication, alignment, possibly overlap and shared interest, or we can have gaps where these interests and these objectives can get lost. So that's the goal of this panel today. It's to bridge some of these gaps and to have some of these conversations in a way that we can talk about what needs to be achieved, how far each party can go to achieve various objectives, how much coordination we need, and what may remain out of our control. If so, okay, how does each of these parties live with it? So to discuss these complex topics, I am absolutely delighted and honored to be joined by this amazing panel. I will go simply in the order of, who's seated where. So allow me to introduce you first, Monsieur Joaquim Nunes de Almeida, Deputy Director-General of the Directorate-General for Internal Market. Oh, pardon.
But it was kind.
No, well, good to know that I have it wrong. DG Grow is effectively holding the pen on many of the internal market initiatives around CRMs. Amanda van Dyke of Arch Emerging Partners, who will discuss with us really the investor's perspective. Monsieur Koen, who is Director-General of the Directorate-General for International Partnerships, so very much looking at the external aspect of these relationships. And Jan Klawitter, who is at the end of the panel there, who is the Head of International Policy for Anglo. Thank you very much for being here. And before we dive in, I want to specifically thank the teams at DG Grow and INTPA who welcomed this initiative and worked with us to make it happen. So it is very much a testament to their commitment that we are all here today. What I propose is that we start perhaps with a short opening statement from each of you to perhaps give your perspective, where you sit in this complex chain of decision-making and positioning on the CRM agenda. Shall we start in the same order, or?
Perfect. Same order is fine.
Monsieur Almeida.
I think that, talking about strategic partnerships, Africa, I would say that we need to see more or less what can we count on in Europe. We have some mining industry, but we're not hugely powerful on mining, which is not to say that we don't have something on mining. We're very strong offsetters in the sense that we are very strong purchasers of products coming out of mining, and that community clearly needs to be brought in. And we're also quite strong on everything that has to do with mining technologies, like the machinery that you need in order to mine. Therefore, we will probably have to team with some mining industry on a friend shoring concept, as we possibly don't. We have some again, but we don't have enough. And then when looking at partnerships, you know, and in the little experience I have had of engaging with third countries, there are two things that they, you know, I think that first of all, we should go there and say, you know, clearly our intention is to diversify our supply of raw materials. The Critical Raw Materials Act is about re-establishing this industry in Europe, but we clearly understand that we will never be able to, nor do we want even to advertise that goal as ours. We will be reliant on the rest of the world to a large extent, and we want that reliance to be as diversified as possible. And therefore we have this instrument, strategic partnerships, and there the issue is usually we approach these countries and we say, we want access to your raw materials, we need access to raw materials. That means that we need to have a capacity to gear up business we need to bring business deals to the table. At the end of the day, that's what we're going to be judged for. These countries will say, yes, very nice, but what exactly do you want to bring here? What investment are you going to bring here? What money are you going to bring here? But then they usually ask for two things. They want a local industry. They don't say, they're never happy with the fact of just extracting raw materials and then you Europeans take it all back home and do whatever you want to do it there. They don't like that. That's a message that doesn't pass. They want to establish local industries, and they want to improve their ESG standards. They see us as helpers in that regard, but of course not to the point that it chokes them of their capacity to export to us. So we have to beware also of not imposing on other countries of the world the ESG standards that we impose on our own, while trying to strive for as high ESG standards as you can, which tends to be in the interest of the country concerned. I'll shut up.
Thank you. Koen?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having us here. It's not the first time that I participate in an ECFR discussion on critical raw materials. I already did one in Berlin some time ago with Theo Murphy, and I'm also sure that this is not the last one that I'll be participating in, precisely because, as you've set out, as Magdalena has set out, I think it is a very complex endeavor that we've embarked on. It's like solving a Rubik's Cube, where you need to turn the different things in the right direction at the right time in order to move towards solution. And there are a number of players. You nicely laid them out. So the exercise is not a straightforward one. From a strategic point of view, of course, the task is very clear. And I think if you listen to the press conference that President von der Leyen had earlier today with President Michel in preparing the G7 summit in Hiroshima, it's a nice reminder of how, strategically speaking, it applies to Europe, but it applies to other partners across the globe as well, as we embark on indeed the needs of this green transition, digital transition, security demands, and we have seen how in today's world the geopolitics affect geoeconomics. We are revisiting all of that, and Europe finds itself indeed, like so many others, in the need to diversify and secure its supply chains, and that's definitely true for critical raw materials, not only for critical raw materials, but definitely true for critical raw materials. Now, if you look at it from our partners' perspective, something very similar is true. Whether you look at Latin America, at Central Asia, Southeast Asia, or Africa, partners as well live in the same world of a real imperative of reducing strategic dependencies by diversifying the supply chains. Now, if we then look at CRM and Africa more particularly, obviously a lot of critical raw materials and strategic raw materials that we are looking for, Africa has a wealth of them. Not only Africa has them, there are other parts of the world, and we're obviously discussing with all of them, but Africa has a wealth of them. And of course, the context created means that this is a real opportunity for Africa. So what we see, and this is for us a very important starting point, is actually that our interests, and probably Africa's interests to a large extent, can overlap. That if you look at the two Venn diagrams, that there is a space that we can both occupy in a win-win. That does bring a number of requirements, and one of them, and they've been spelled out very clearly, I think, in the Critical Raw Materials Act and in the communication that goes with it, is that the European approach will be driven by these kind of win-win partnerships, where we will not only try to secure access, but actually see how, together with that, we can work on something that is beneficial for our partners as well. And that's for us a critical entry point. So it is about developing an ecosystem. It is developing the regulatory frameworks, the capacity building of the state, the skills, the training, and importantly, part of the value addition. So not just exploration and export of raw materials, but part of the value addition to be done in our partner countries. That requires an alignment of a whole set of, let's say, criteria, actors, and so on and so on. I can come back to that because that's, I guess, the key point of the discussion here today is how do we align all those different players? And that's what we are doing within the Commission in the first instance. I mean, you here have DG INTPA and DG GROW, but obviously DG Trade is involved, DG NET is involved, DG Connect is involved. So we have a whole mobilization, a whole of government approach within the Commission. And we are doing the same in very intense work, obviously, with our member states, with the European DFIs, EIB, EBRD, the different banks that we have, KfW, AFD, and so on, and with the export credit agencies and the private sector. But we can develop some of those topics today. But the starting point really is this search for win-win partnerships between us and notably our African partners.
Thanks very much. And of course, the whole complexity is that the companies and the investors that make this potential happen are not necessarily based in Africa. Some of them are. Many of them come from other jurisdictions. So Anglo-American is specifically one of these companies that has a long African history and continues to grow in Africa.
Going then. Well, there we go. Thanks everyone, and thanks for the invite to be here today. It also switches off. Is it working?
Oh.
Can you tell the mic? Use this one. Okay. Well, yes, Ludivine, as you say, we're very much a Southern African company by origin. Founded out of South Africa, obviously with Anglo-American money. Well over 100 years ago, we work in a number of commodities, some of which, or many of which, actually fall into the critical or strategic raw materials. And to delve just right in, Mr. Almeida and Koen, sorry, I forgot your family name, so I should just say Koen. Koen. Have already laid out the challenge, right? There is obviously the mining challenge. You've got to find what you want. You've got to actually build the projects, and it's not only building the projects, but there is a lot of infrastructure and services that actually need to go with that. There is, of course, the labor aspect. Then there is the extraction itself. Then there is potential beneficiation and the shipping of the product, etc., going into market where it gets processed, etc., etc. frankly, the mining piece is probably, technically speaking, the easiest part, right? It's the non-technical. It's the non-technical issues that are the challenges for us and our various stakeholders. And yes, they want jobs, and no country probably that actually sits on resources will be happily this transition unless it is a just one in their understanding. And that means very different things to very different countries. And within the countries, to different stakeholders. You've got the government, you've got the communities, you've got other actors, you've got companies in those countries who would like to get supply deals or who would like to collaborate. You've got others who are, you've got companies who are directly in the mining value chain, but you've also got lots of adjacent agriculture, for example, tourism, etc., in those countries, which is why it's really, really important to have that broader developmental lens, or to take that broader developmental approach, actually. Which is something that we've been trying to do for quite some time, with some success, I would say, but there's still a long way to go for all of us. Look, I'm sure we'll have plenty of back and forth here now, so I'll probably leave it at this for the moment.
Thanks very much. And indeed, one of the opportunities around CRM is the fact that we're going to be developing all sizes of deposits with all sizes of companies. So, Amanda, why don't you give us the view that Arch Emerging Partners takes on this agenda at the moment?
So, hello everybody. Thank you for having me. The reason I'm here is because I manage a development stage sustainable mining fund that invests solely in critical raw materials. But to take a step back as to what a private equity fund is and why private equity is important to the market, if you have a new mine, if you want to invest in building a new mine, a new supply of critical materials, you have two options. One, a large integrated miner can buy or develop your project and put it into production. Or you can try to develop it yourself on a small company basis. If you're going to develop it, either scenario require a combination of hundreds of millions of dollars and debt and equity. The equity that invests high-risk capital, because mining is a very high-risk business, even more so if you're going to try to invest in Africa, tends to come from the private equity industry. And there's about 15 funds around the world that invest in the private equity side of the mining sector, of which we are one of the smaller ones. And part of what is to notice here is that not one of them are located in Europe. There is very little mining investment expertise located or left in Europe, even though they have a long historical capacity for mining, but it isn't there anymore. Our firm is Arch, the AR is African Rainbow Capital. We're a joint venture between a UK-based emerging markets investor and African Rainbow Capital in South Africa, which is a group that has its roots in the mining sector. And we have 4 funds. The first 2 funds that were launched are an African Logistics Fund and an African Renewable Power Fund. Mine was the 3rd fund. It's a Critical Raw Materials Development Fund, and it's a global capacity. Even though the majority of our investments are in Africa, it's based on the fact that the critical raw materials industry is a global industry. You can't just do a regional strategy. It's just not the way the industry works. And we look to invest not only in the raw materials, but in the beneficiation, in shortening and making the supply chain more sustainable. So that's why our strategy, by definition, even though it has its roots in Africa, has to be global. And then our last fund, ironically, that is being launched as we speak, is not yet launched, is a joint venture with Italy. Italian engineering firms who want to launch an impact strategy into Africa. The reason I think I'm here today is because of the importance of equity capital, regardless of whether it comes from a company or the private sector in any project development. it costs hundreds. The amount, I think Tesla came out about a month ago saying, and there are different, Benchmark, we'll talk about it later, in every stage of the energy transition, we're going to need investment into different capacity. And they estimate that we need about 500, it's anywhere between 500 billion and $1 trillion to be invested in new metals generating capacity. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Mining is one of them, so is recycling, but that's a lot of money. And a large percentage of that is going to come from equity risk capital. You cannot fund it all with debt. Somebody has to take the risk to own the companies that make the investment in the ground. And so any critical raw materials strategy has to consider where the money is going to come from and what the considerations are of the risk investing in that sector. And I guess that's what we're here to talk about today.
Thanks very much. And it's true that one of the complexities is that priorities at the moment don't seem to necessarily align. So what I was hoping you could discuss with us is what are the priorities with regard to Africa, countries, strategies where you want to focus on? Because part of the question is this where investment is going? Is this where companies are going?
This one? Okay, good, no problem. Well, I don't have an answer to that, because what the Act and the communication obviously does is it lists precisely the raw materials that are considered as critical and strategic. And that's the starting point. From there onwards, we then look at countries in Africa and elsewhere that have those raw materials, and from there the discussion starts. And that's why we have started, we have a list of strategic partnership countries with whom we are having discussions, starting with the signatures that we're looking at of Memorandum of Understanding, which then translate into roadmaps where we go more into the details of it. But all of this is not, let's say, a theoretical exercise done in Brussels and in the capitals or the administrations of our partner countries, because that's exactly where then precisely reality kicks in, which is how do we then bring the private equity funds to the table? How do we bring the investors to the table? How do we bring the banks to the table? How do we bring the export credit agency to the table, and so on, so that we can actually discuss with all of the players that you need to align whether we can create this alignment of actors and instruments that is needed precisely to reach results in what is, by all means, a very complex endeavor. There is no single bullet, and therefore it's not for us to say, okay, this is the country, and now this is what we're going to do, and you all have to align on that one. It requires discussions, it requires time and investment. If I look at probably the one with which we are advancing most, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, is Namibia. We've made significant progress there on green hydrogen production, but on CRM we are advancing. But even with a country well advanced, well organized, with solid interlocutors, a lot of time and work is still needed in investing, because of course they want to get it right, and they are right to want to get it right, and so do we. So it will require time to align and discuss all the different stakeholders that are needed. So it's impossible to say this and this is the country on which we bank, because that's not how it can work. We have a list of countries with which we are discussing MOUs and subsequently roadmaps, but it's not because we have that it's game done. It will require a lot of work, and that's what we're doing.
Amazing. And Jan, when we prepared, we did discuss the regional focus, where you see opportunities and barriers. So it's interesting to know that the partnerships are basically the start of a conversation. Yes, they are. Okay.
Very much so, and I think when you're talking about intergovernmental conversations, that helps to set a framework and set a base. But as early as possible, you want to bring those investors, banks, whatever agencies, and please also the mining companies in, because they're effectively, and actually the supply chain, etc., the suppliers to the mining companies, those who are actually going to build the infrastructure, etc., because they're the ones who will be doing the work, who will be building, constructing, digging, exporting, etc. The other thing I think, and it goes back to the point that you made on the in the first round, is when you say in the case of Namibia, for example, that you're well advanced on the hydrogen side. The original angle, if I'm not mistaken, there is actually the export of hydrogen, right? The important piece is, however, how can it also help Namibia and sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Africa to actually overcome their own problems in terms of having access to power? Because that is a huge problem. And I think that's a problem that we face in our existing operations, but we will face it even more in additional operations. Which is why we've been partnering, for example, not in Namibia but in South Africa, just over the border, with ENGIE, to build a renewable network that helps to power our own operations by installing up to 5 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030, but then also use that to feed it into the grid and help South Africa actually to overcome its own power crisis. And I think that the mindset is really important, that we put ourselves into the position of what does the country actually need and want.
Quickly pick up on that, because that's exactly what we're doing, obviously. It would be impossible to pursue the kind of green hydrogen partnership with Namibia that we are pursuing without fully taking into account that, first of all, Namibia has energy needs of itself, and that as we produce or as we work to co-invest with the Namibians in the production of energy with solar, wind, and so on, first of all, this is to serve a Namibian market, and not just Namibian market. We are looking at interconnectors between Namibia and Angola, between Namibia and South Africa. We are looking at strategic corridors that link up the whole SADC, and additionally, indeed, because they can produce, I mean, an excessive amount of green hydrogen. The ports, European ports, are investing with the port of Ludivine to build the capacity for future export of green hydrogen. And the same applies to critical raw materials. The discussion we're having with them, but also we'll be having with some of the Central African countries, are very much about exactly that. It's not just what do we do and what that is useful for future exports to Europe. It is about what do they need and what kind of spillover effects can we create that are beneficial for their own industrial projects. I mean, as you know, the DRC and Zambia are discussing already on the 2 Cs, cobalt, copper, special economic zone, potential future of battery production. These are the kind of things that we incorporate in the discussions we are having with them. We think that it is really important, because that's the only way in which you can actually make it into a win-win. And we actually consider that, compared to some of the other offers that partners have, that probably by banking on this kind of win-win, that we increase the value addition locally and for our partners' economies, that actually this is, let's say, a competitive advantage we want to offer.
So it's a much wider scope than a supply arrangement. It's a very holistic approach. Mr. Almeida, you wanted to discuss...
I mean, you said something that was very right, which is we should understand what the countries need in exchange for having a privileged relationship with us. In the sense that, for instance, like, you know, we shouldn't go there and say, this is what you need. We want your raw materials, and in exchange, we think that you need to improve your environmental standards by doing A, B, and C. No. I mean, we should say, we want your raw materials, and what do you want? But for instance, just to give you an example, South Africa, it's obvious, for instance, that one of the things that would be important for them was how are you going to address the coal miners, because the mines, we want them to close their coal mines because we don't want electricity generated by coal, and the administration thinks, well, what can we do in that regard? Or the South African mining industry tells us that there's a huge security problem in South Africa, for instance, or that the train system is also crumbling, and that there possibly needs to be something to be done about that, etc. So we have to be very attentive to what the local needs are. And to go back to what Koen Doens said, I mean, I can remember your surname. Another issue that I think in terms of partnerships, lists of countries, etc., that my experience in this has shown is that we have to be quite open-minded in the sense that half of the world is somewhat interesting in terms of critical raw materials. We don't have resources to engage with half of the world because it's not just a question of signing an MOU and signing a roadmap. There's a whole follow-up that is much more onerous than just the signing of the MOU and the roadmap is already a lot of work. But all the work that follows, if we want to be serious, and we want to be serious, takes a lot of, is that we should also be prepared for setbacks in the sense that we can't in the Berlaymont Monde decide this is our list of priorities if those people don't want to be priority with us. So we have to be prepared also for second bests, or if we have a country on the list, but if that country on the list is being somewhat slow, and there's another country that has half of what the first has, well, probably better go for the second.
Hence the notion of also building this coalition of information, projects, ideas. And yeah, I definitely want to get your view on this because we've already raised the issue of local value addition a couple of times.
Well, I'm actually going to step a little bit back and repeat some of the words that is this working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, this one works.
I hope so.
Hello?
Yeah.
MOUs, roadmaps, plans. Hello? Oh, like this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Above the line. Because
Oh, wow.
Okay. And relationships, these things all take time. And every country in the world, Europe is actually in a race. And you're competing. You're actually competing with America, China. It's three countries, all who have energy transition aims that require critical materials, and who need a great deal more minerals and a secure supply chain. And there are three things that are going to get it. You're not exclusively saying, well done on Namibia. It's a relatively small country, and you've done well. But behind the scenes, I happen to know Namibia is also talking to China actively and actively talking to America. And in the end of the day, they want the investment, right? And they want the investment that meets their needs. And I'm very happy to hear that Europe is listening to what they want rather than just what they want them to do. It's a huge first step. But on the other, for a long time, a lot of Western investors went and told Africa what they needed, and it tended to piss them off. Finally, that has changed, and I think the world has listened. But we're dealing with a situation where China has spent the last 20 years developing relationships with Africa specifically. And its money comes a lot faster with a lot less strings. And America has suddenly woken up and realized they need critical raw materials as well, and they're throwing money at everything, as Americans tend to. Despite the accent, I'm not actually American. But this is a race that we're in. And the Chinese, they put a lot of money into it, and they moved a lot faster than we did, and they're in pole position. And in addition to that, we're going to have to work hard and I think realize that, like you said, you can't do it with every country, but going slowly and working on slow agreements and slow planning in the end, you're going to find you're left with a lot of MOUs and no deals. I think one has to be very careful in balancing doing it right with doing it at all. Because there really is a race going on right now for materials.
So is this where there can be a balance between a public sector conversation triggering or facilitating private sector action? In that case, then this is the private sector to engage.
Look, I mean, you're absolutely right. Speed matters, and speed is not what Europe does best. We know that, but at least the awareness that speed matters is there. But we also know that when it comes to pure speed, we're not gonna be the number one, and that's why we focus so much on, yes, being as fast as we can, but adding to that a qualitative aspect on which we think we can make a difference. And as you've said, compared to a past of engagement that was, let's say, done in a different way, we have now clearly switched, and that goes for CRM, but it goes for the whole approach to our relationship with partners on the African continent, is rather than talking to them, is talking with them, and is especially listening to what they want. And I think that the change of approach is being noticed, and I think it is a critical one. I very much agree with you. China has a long lead, has quite an advantage. On the other hand, I think that partners also see, yes, the advantages, but also the downsides. And when it comes to the impacts of some of those investments from an environmental point of view, from a labor point of view, from a social point of view, even from a financial and economic point of view, I think there are clear downsides on that approach that is fast, I mean, make maybe our offer, if we do it well, more attractive. It will, at the end of the day, boil down to a question on, I mean, do you want it fast or do you want it to last? And I think that there the distinction we made is definitely that we will want to do something more durable, something more sustainable over time, and that will be a fundamental part of our offer.
And to rebound on this, although I feel like we just started, but I want to leave time for the audience's questions. There is one aspect of the whole CRM Act package that is very striking, and it's this focus on local value addition. How do you envisage those conversations? And more importantly, what, if anything, can mining companies, the investors that back them, do in that context? Because we have been trying to do this for many decades, and it's not necessarily always worked. So how can we change the paradigm to perhaps achieve it better this time in the context of the European positions? I'm going to ask everybody the same question, because this is a topic that is huge across all of the jurisdictions that we work. Shall I start with you, Monsieur Almeida?
Well, if we have an industrial policy, we cannot sort of close our eyes to the fact that others might have industrial policies of their own too. As I said in my introductory remark, there's one thing that is clear from all the potential partnership countries that I have engaged with, that they want to make sure is that this will help themselves develop themselves industrially. So, you know, they might be aiming at pretty impossible goals like becoming, you know, yeah, they'd like to be an EV battery powerhouse, or they want to go upstream as much as possible. I think that we need to be conscientious of their needs and adapt. But one thing is clear, yes, they want to upgrade themselves. They want more value added at their national level.
And at the moment, are we mobilizing the efforts that can achieve this?
Well, I think that we have, I mean, one of the differences we have with China is that also that, you know, it's very easy for China to mobilize its private sector, in the sense that, you know, if China decides something, the private sector follows. We in America are a bit different. We can't just tell our private sector, you come with us. There's more of a, you know, it's, but there are, we definitely need to develop intelligent public-private partnerships with the private sector that we see as friendly to be able to be mobilized for such efforts, because at the end of the day we're not going to be judged because we have opened a mining school in country X, Y, or Z, but if we have brought about a big project.
Can I respond directly to that? What I would say is China didn't, if you watch what China did, they didn't quite simply say to their private enterprise invested in the African supply chain and in their manufacturing supply chain within China. And one of the things that Europe actually does have, or the West has on China, is China only wants the raw materials. They're not willing to invest in any upstream capacity in country. And I also agree with you. Battery factories in the DRC are probably not likely despite that, but more beneficiation in country is both more sustainable and efficient and absolutely possible. And one of the ways you can incentivize these countries to work with you is being willing to invest in some of that upstream capacity. That's a huge way. But one of the ways that China did it is they didn't, state-owned enterprises don't own African mining projects. State-owned, what happened was China said to its private sector, go invest in Africa. We will back you. If you need the equity, if you need the loans or cheap loans, we will give it to you. They incentivized their private sector actually to invest in Africa, and some of them invested very badly. But that's something that Europe is capable of doing. And frankly, the EIB and development banks within Europe and around the world have been backing private equity for risk capital has been backed by development banks for a long time. And guaranteeing loans for a lot of this kind of thing has been something you can do similar to what China did. It's not impossible within the European context.
Koen, and then we'll go to Jan.
But exactly, I mean, to reply also to your question, the more demanding our African partners are, the better it is. We think they should insist on having part of the processing value addition done in their countries. We think they should insist on everything being done according to high ESG standards. We think they should insist on partners investing in capacity building of their state. They should invest in building a local labor force and in investing in tertiary education for people to be part of this whole value chain. The more demanding they are, ultimately, the more equipped they will find in Europe a partner willing to do that. And I think we are now, and that's precisely the conversations we are having, then to line up, indeed, the private equity funds, the mining companies and those who can actually do the industrial investments with the DFIs in view of, indeed, de-risking equity. And that's, I mean, as you know, we have a new instrument, EFSD Plus, that allows us to fund it with development money, where we provision a provisioning fund for the guarantee to do these kind of de-risking operations. I'm not hiding that for many DFIs, they are rediscovering this. Apart from the EBRD, they all are extremely wary of this. So we're working with them to bring them slowly but surely back into this area. That's why we're talking also to the export credit agencies, which are a critical port of call for many of the companies before they invest. So we're lining up these players, but the goal really is to do exactly that. Bring part of the processing to our African partners, and not only that, but invest much broader in the whole ecosystem. And therefore, again, what I'm saying is the more demanding our African partners are, the better actually I think it is for them but also for us.
Jan, can I bring you in on this? Because you've been having these conversations with these governments, or we have as a mining sector for a while. So what's your view on Europe's positioning on this?
So maybe to start with, sorry, there were so many things in the last few comments. On the speed point, the mining industry itself is not exactly known for speed, unfortunately, right? It's a very long-term industry. So I think if we have one thing, then it is actually time, because it's in the nature of the business to an extent, which doesn't mean that there is time for complacency, but I think we're an industry that is traditionally run by engineers, and they like to plan, and they like to be very, very clear about everything, how it works, and of course, let's not forget, linking back to the sustainability topic or the ESG topic, safety is of paramount importance, right? People need to go home, they need to go to work, and then they need to get home again, in the same way, shape, and form that they came to work. So, it takes me to another point again on this question of the different interests and understanding of what ESG actually means. I remember being at the Mining Indaba earlier this year on a panel. There was somebody saying, "Look, all this ESG talk and the requirements. You know what it means for us here? It's eat, sleep, and go to work." Well, it depends on whom you ask. I'm not saying we should lower the requirements, and I think it's all in the interest of actually, in the end, creating a level playing field, right, between the various competitors that we were talking about, be they state-owned, be they private, wherever they are in the value chain, actually, and I actually just came back from China. I was there last week, and we interacted with various of our stakeholders, and I honestly think that the ones that we spoke to, including mining associations, etc., they do have the sustainability topic very firmly on their radar, not the least because of some of the legislation that is being passed here, which actually reaches up and down value chains, right? And they need to think about this, because otherwise they will have a problem with exporting. So there may be a bit of a lag, and there is a bit of head scratching as to how do we actually do this, because it's maybe not what has it's not the practice that has been worked to in the past. But let's be honest, there are also Western companies who have not been working to those standards, right? Very clearly. So when bringing it back to us, and I don't want to give you like corporate speak here, but we've got something that is called the Sustainable Mining Plan, launched that in 2018, in which we have set ourselves certain stretch goals in the different sustainability buckets. So it's building on environmental stretch goals for ourselves, looking at reducing our carbon footprint, water footprint, being proactive on biodiversity, etc. Then you've got the same on the social side with education, with job creation, etc. And actually, the important piece is not job creation in the mine, but off the mine, right? And that's what we'll have to measure ourselves against. And also sustainable jobs. It's not the job that you create that will be gone in a year or two, or even at the end of the of life of the mine, but you want it to continue beyond the life of the mine. So setting up sustainable economies actually around your mine. Supported is all of this by what we call in Anglo collaborative regional development, where we actually try to bring the different stakeholders together and first do a spatial analysis of the area in which we want to mine and look at what is possible. Because back to the point of what does community A actually want, it may not always be possible or the best thing to do. So we go back, we do a joint analysis with them about what can you best grow, for example. What are the industries that you can actually get off and start off in that in the region, and combining that with working with them on bringing in programs in the health space, in the education space, in water sanitation, actually making it possible for industries to grow in the first space, having access to energy. Because you can have the greatest plan around building an economy around the mine, if you don't have any of the capacity of the capabilities and capacity in place, etc. So it's actually, and that goes unfortunately back to the speed point, right? This stuff doesn't happen fast. Just like the mine is not built in a day. But what it takes is coming in, as you say, not telling them what to do or how to do it, but actually jointly work out how it's best done in everybody's interest.
I just want to make sure we have time for some questions, and then we'll do a concluding remarks. I'm carefully not looking at my ECFR colleagues because I know we're going to go over time. Yes.
Thank you very much. Excellent discussion. I'm Caner Can. I'm Energy Counselor at the Turkish delegation to the EU, permanent delegation to the EU. Also, I'm a PhD candidate working on the role of critical raw minerals in Europe's energy security and foreign policy. It's my topic. So we all agree that Africa will be the Middle East for Europe in the 1970s. So Europe found a way out natural gas for this dependence, but this time the story is very complicated. And we see that the targets, ambitious targets, are very important in terms of critical raw materials, in terms of green transition. And we need a booming sector in mining. And with a focus, when we look at Africa, we talk about energy scarcity. So there's a problem in terms of energy in Africa. And when we look at the mining sector, 70% of the mining sector depends on energy costs. So do you think there's a paradox in terms of international energy institutions and international financial institutions providing long-term credits for oil and gas projects in Africa? And also a very quick question, do you think Turkey, because we have over 50 embassies and Turkish Airlines fly over 40 countries in Africa, do you think a candidate country, EU candidate country, Turkey, can help this vulnerability in Europe in terms of these problems? Thank you very much.
Before we take these two questions, shall we take one more from the floor and then answer that and wrap it up? I think there's a brave gentleman in the back.
Thanks very much. Tony Gilland from MCC Brussels. Really interested in all the comments that have been made. The European Union, telling people what they need and telling them what to do is second nature. It's what the European Union does. So all these comments about ESG at the end were really, really important. I thought the points that Jan was making and the points that Amanda was making before were really, really important. So I'd like to ask the panel, but particularly the commissioners, if Europe is serious about engaging with countries in different ways, how can it demonstrate that? Is it willing to review its own ESG guidelines and the way in which it monitors companies? Is it willing to consider a different approach, taking on board some of the points that have been made by the other panelists? Because if it is, and it can demonstrate that, then maybe other countries, third-party countries, will believe you. But as it stands, it's not clear they will.
Goodness. Thank you. So may I propose that we go around the panel and address these three questions I noted in total. And then we'll move to some closing remarks.
Can I just address quickly your question on energy first? It's actually because it's incorrect. It can be up to 70% of the cost of mining is energy, but it's much closer to 25 to 40% of the cost of mining. Now, 80% of the world's mines are open pit, which means big trucks, and a lot of them are diesel. But it's not quite as high as that. It is a huge problem in Africa where they don't have energy. But interestingly, Africa is in the process of leapfrogging, kind of like they did with telecommunications when it comes to energy. Our other fund, it's renewable power for Africa. And actually, one of their best investments is something called cross-boundary energy. It's not my investment, so I'm not plugging them necessarily. But they've made all their money supplying renewable power facilities and microgrids directly to mines. 'Cause it's actually cheaper to set up a microgrid, and we're setting up one on a mine we're investing in now, than it is to get diesel all the way to a remote site and then run everything on diesel. And you're going to find, I think, that increasingly when new capacity is part of what we do is we invest in new mines and we try to give them a customized ESG. To your question, back on this, is every mine's sustainable solution is different. Right? There is no one sustainable solution. Every mine's sustainable solution is different. And it's about the EU, I believe, and everyone understanding that sustainability is important and sustainability principles are important, but you have to find the right sustainable solution, the low carbon, socially responsible, balanced stakeholder approach to investing in every place. And I think that increasingly, the mining industry is answering that challenge of finding sustainable mining solutions. And Anglo-American, he can't say it himself, but they are actually market leaders in sustainable mining. They're probably the best performing major miner globally in terms of how sustainably they mine.
Gold star for Jan. So we've covered the energy question, but it's true that we will need a booming sector. How can this be facilitated with the policy positions we're discussing here? And how can there be more of an overlap between the interests of this mining sector needing to progress and the policy shapers who need it to be producing CRMs? Start with Jan.
Sure. Well, look. A comment I wanted to make while that came to me while you were speaking was exactly the point on energy and mining, and the point that it's not only about the grid power that we get, but actually the diesel that we use in those countries, which is something that for us as a miner makes, depending on where you are. But in Africa, certainly, it's the second largest carbon contributor to our carbon emissions. And to address that, I come back again to my sort of systemic and holistic approach, because when we went into the renewable energy project that I was talking earlier about, we looked at how we do not only power our operations, but how do we look at displacing the diesel? And we are doing that since May last year by having transformed one of our 500-ton trucks from a diesel engine to a hybrid battery fuel cell truck. These things, just for people in the room, they consume about up to 3,500 liters of diesel a day. And they run 24/7. So we looked into how we can actually do this. Coming back to partnerships, we didn't do it ourselves because we don't build trucks. But the OEMs, at the time when we were starting to look into this, which was about 5 years ago, were not terribly interested in helping us out because they were making money off the internal combustion engines that there are, actually the diesel-powered trucks. The beauty of the trucks is that they are actually electric vehicles with a diesel genset on top. So you can replace it, but it still takes a lot of work. But what we do is we can produce our own fuel, namely hydrogen, at site by installing all the renewable power, whether it's solar, wind. And we've started to do that last year. One of these trucks is driving around, and we're now in the second stage where we're actually trying to roll this out across our operations. Sorry, back to you. It was just something because it's a tangible example of. Because very often we talk high level, but this is actually something that we did, and it's driving around in the mine. It works, and now we have to take it to the next stage. The question was.
I think the outstanding questions was what can we do to enable a booming mining sector. And then the question of the credibility of the discourse. So may I leave the last comments to Koen and Monsieur Almeida to embrace these challenging questions.
With pleasure. I mean, first of all, on energy and Africa's energy gap. I mean, it's obvious and it's independent from the mining sector. It affects everything. There is an access issue still in most, if not all, African countries, and as they industrialize, this issue will grow. But that's precisely why we want to focus massively on the renewable energy potential. I don't think that gas and oil sector currently needs subsidies to blossom given the prices that they get. So we really want to focus on how can we unlock the huge renewable energy capacity of the African continent, be it on geothermal, solar, photovoltaic, wind power, and so on. And that's where we move most of our investments in the energy sector too. As regards the EU and its normative power, I leave the comments you made for yourself. I don't think we impose any thing on anyone else. What we do is we legislate for ourselves. We have a certain ambition for Europe when it comes to economy, society. That translates indeed into legislation that affects how we do business in Europe and affects the business of those who want to export to Europe. So we have a set of standards that apply and that are, in my view, not for revision. That's very clear. Everyone who wants access to the European market needs to respect those standards. In our engagement with partners, we look indeed at how we can work with them to support them in meeting those standards. And a lot of the discussions we're having, the dialogues we are having, the investments we are making, and that applies to public investments, but also to private investments, are precisely driven by that, which is how can you increase the barrier of the level of standards that are applied. So that's a slightly different view, if I may, than the one expressed by the person who asked the question.
Mr. Almeida.
Well, I think possibly the big elephant in the room, or the big challenge that we all have to face politically, is that I think that the wider public, even a great part of the political class, it's still not clearly understood how much mining is indispensable to achieve the greatest environmental good of all, which is to fight climate change. This is very countersensical because people tend to see mining as dangerous environmentally, it's dirty, it's not a good thing, there's a sort of a 19th century industrial revolution thing about it. And you have to hammer the message again and again that we need that mining, extraction, is absolutely indispensable if we are to achieve the biggest environmental challenge that we have. So there must be something clean about it. Now, also, I mean, on the question of standards, I mean, as Koen said, I mean, we have, the deal in the Critical Raw Materials Act was that this is about Europe, is that we ask European authorities to speed up their processes to have faster mining. So it mostly insists on permitting one-stop shops, administrations going fast. but there has been no reduction of the environmental body of laws. So basically, the permitting will have to be given faster, but you will still have to verify whether the Water Directive is being respected, whether the Wildlife Directive is being respected, whether the Natura 2000, I mean, all the environmental acquis has been kept, except for, except as far as we're asking the administrations to act faster. Now, outside of Europe, of course, our laws do not apply extraterritorially. I mean, we're not going to impose the water and the wildlife directive that we have in Europe to Congo, South Africa, Chile, or Argentina. That would be quite preposterous. Now, the only thing that we probably can talk about with them is like, you know, what can we do together to respect international environmental law, or to find ad hoc, as one of you said, I think, there's always something ad hoc about the sustainability of each mine. What can you do to improve the sustainability of this mining project in particular? But I think that we give ourselves quite a bit of intelligent leeway and margin of maneuver there, knowing that, you know, probably, you know, many countries in the world are here, and Europe environmentally is here. We're not asking them to do this, but we're probably asking them to do this.
And I think we're going to wrap it up because we have gone massively over time. Before I thank this excellent panel, 2 points that I'm taking away, which somewhat surprised me. The first one is there is quite a lot of overlap in the approach. It's very holistic. Strategic partnerships are much wider than CRMs. Energy will be a big part of it. So there is a complete approach, and in that sense, I think more of a match than I thought between the investment and mining approach and the EU. The second thing that I'm taking away is time. We agree there's urgency, but we also all agree the time needed to do this well will be expended because it's absolutely necessary. The last thing I would say is that there was one voice completely absent from today's discussion, and that is the topic of the next discussion, which is African stakeholders. Across the board, from governments to communities to stakeholder groups, that is where the conversation is headed. But I think we've already clarified a lot of things today, so I want to thank this amazing panel. Thank you. Thank you as an excellent audience.
Just before you go, there are drinks outside, and thank you for being here. As Mr. Doens said and Ludivine stressed now, this is not the last panel we're having on these conversations, so you're invited to follow us and follow the discussion on with African stakeholders and with financial institutions. New panels are coming up in the coming weeks. Thank you.